everyone. As after our intros, we don't need to actually go into those, so I'm just going to kick off. So on this panel, sort of question one, how do you think, I'm going to ask this to Naveen, how have the regimes over the last, let's say, 10 to 15 years changed, and how has that influenced across our border restructuring?
Thank you for the question, and very nice to be here. I think the example I would use here is probably our capita. So for people that remember, that was a Bahraini-based company that went into a Chapter 11 process actually during the GFC, so 08, 09, if I get my dates correct. I think there are a couple of lessons, or a few lessons to learn from our capita. It's very interesting that a Bahraini company went into a US process. I think that's the first observation. I think the second question is, well, why did that happen? And I think it's very important or encouraging in the UAE and Saudi that there are now insolvency regimes, and there have been for quite a while, that allow these kind of processes to be resolved within those countries. So the UAE, we all know, has a great insolvency regime. You can cram down creditors, you can take businesses from scenarios where they might go into liquidation 15 years ago and bring them out of that position and actually have them survive and thrive. I think the reason our capita went into a US Chapter 11 so many years ago was there just wasn't that insolvency regime in Bahrain in particular. And I would hazard a guess that if that scenario were to play itself out again today, and that corporate was in the UAE or that corporate was in Saudi, I don't think there would be a need, or indeed perhaps even a desire for that company to go through a US process. I think it could be done in the UAE, I think it could be done in Saudi. So that would be my kind of main example here is, look, our capita 15 odd years ago, maybe a bit more, versus what could be done today.
Perfect. Great. Cool. Moving on. This is about law, so I think actually, Nikki, you're probably the best able to answer. How do the varying laws around insolvency across all the different measures, how do they impact cross-border restructuring efforts?
Sure. So obviously nowadays companies tend to have assets or exposure in different presence in different jurisdictions, and so when you're looking at restructuring, you have to think about what you're doing in one jurisdiction and how that might impact other jurisdictions. And if there's no sort of recognition regime in place, it can create quite a lot of complexity. You're always looking what might happen if it goes into an insolvency process, and it can obviously be a bit of a mess if you find you've got different competing processes in different parts of the world. And the other thing is that it can be a bit of an opportunity because you can shop for different jurisdictions to get the outcome that you need. And so you might find that there's potentially insolvency proceedings available to implement a restructuring, whether that's in a sort of a consensual way or as some sort of contingency plan. But you might find that there's options available in different jurisdictions, and if you can use them to access those different jurisdictions, you might be able to get a better outcome for the stakeholders of the business.
Great, perfect. Okay, and actually that actually ties into the next one. Vikas, I think I'll be coming over to you for this. Cool. So how do you basically sort of handle the different sort of stakeholders? How do you coordinate them, which have proven to be the best in terms of aligning the interests between them all?
Yeah, hi, good afternoon. Can you hear me? Okay.
Yeah.
No, I think just building on some of my other panelists. So I suppose one thing when we're talking about cross-jurisdiction is just not between countries, right? It's actually also within the same country. So if you look at in the UAE, you have 2 or 3 different regimes operating here. In Saudi, that's the case as well. So I think it's important to just navigate that across that piece. So, the more complex the stakeholder, the more difficult it is to implement such processes. I think going back to Nikki, your point, I think companies which are aware of the different regulations actually are seeing precedents being played out in some of these markets, and actually just seeing how that relates to their own situation are likely to be better placed and better outcome for all stakeholders serving the company. So I think what we are finding is agility, because as we look at, companies looking at optionality, how they're coordinating their different stakeholders, keeping them fully informed of that situation, such that as they decide which option they're going to go for, they're all ready to go for it. It's not like a whole process. And actually, very interestingly and importantly, as we all know, there are clearly working groups that are involved, but there are also internal stakeholders that have to be managed, right? And you could have weeks of delay if that hasn't been managed. There's a case that some of the people in this panel are working on right now in Saudi Arabia, and just to explain complexity of trying to put something through a bankruptcy where even in the same country, if you've got different parts of the entity domiciled in different jurisdictions, just that whole intercreditor dynamics, right, which wasn't the case, for example, if you're looking at a group basis. So that becomes an important issue. Where is the cash sitting? What happens if you liquidate one element and not the other element? So there's just a lot of complexity, and I think the best guidance, I suppose, just being in this market now for a long time, is that stakeholder management becomes extremely important. And if you could have the best laid plans, but if you don't have all the stakeholders operating in tandem, I mean, it's just the best laid plan. So that'll be my sense of how that whole thing needs to be orchestrated.
Can I maybe add to that, Vika? So I think on the cross-border element, having a cross-border nexus can sometimes be good for one stakeholder and very bad for another. And an example is JBF, which we closed very recently, where you had a plant in the UAE, you had a plant in Belgium, and you had a plant in Bahrain. And it went through a UAE restructuring process and ultimately was successful. But we did, as the senior secured creditors, look at working up a plan B, which would have seen a COMI shift to the UK, which would have allowed us to execute the UAE restructuring plan in the England and Wales courts. And as a secure creditor, that was an amazing option to have. As a shareholder, it was a much worse option to have. So there's not always synchronicity, stating the obvious. There's not always synchronicity between the various stakeholders. And I think typically as a secure creditor, the ability to go to another jurisdiction to have a stick or to have another option away from the primary jurisdiction is often much more helpful for the secured creditors than it is for the equity.
Great, thanks. Cool, if we can move on if anyone's got anything to chip in. Esteban, I'm going to come to you for this one. Recent trends. Could you provide any insight into some recent high profile cases and what you've actually learned from them?
Well, I mean, building on what my colleagues have been saying, if you see the evolution on the solvency framework, particularly in the UAE and Saudi, is quite, both have followed quite a remarkable pace. I mean, to the extent that we have randomly seen that in other jurisdictions elsewhere in the world, and that connects to the topic of the panel, which is cross-border. Which cross-border, as Vikas explained, I mean, in the context of particularly the UAE as well as Saudi, I mean, you have a cross-border within the country between offshore and onshore jurisdictions and between Emirates, and then, of course, you have what is truly cross-border, and as Nikki was explaining as well, I mean, these days, companies randomly are incorporated in one jurisdiction, having business in one jurisdiction and assets in one jurisdiction. So naturally, you always have some sort of a challenge or in terms of how to work out solutions, depending on multiple stakeholders and jurisdictions. But if you take a view of some sample cases and things that have happened, you take a view. You start, for example, with NMC. NMC, you had two administration processes, one in the PLC, one in the UK, one in EDGM here. Both administrators were the same institution, but working on a protocol and working in cooperation. I mean, when it comes to cross-border insolvency, there are two words that are important: cooperation and reciprocity of enforcement. Okay, I mean, so absent cooperation, and cooperation comes with protocols, agreements, whatever they call them, and reciprocity. Reciprocity is the flip side of the coin of accepting enforcement, okay, and accepting the jurisdiction of another court. When you see NMC, you have a parallel insolvency administration proceedings, working in coordination with different creditors, different assets, but still common problems or certain common problems. Within NMC situation, something quite remarkable happened. I mean, in terms of bankruptcy courts, they generally have imperium of the creditor mass and the asset mass of a company, and they will randomly relinquish jurisdiction. In modern bankruptcy, in modern bankruptcy, you have courts, you have precedents in the UK or US where bankruptcy courts will accept that certain matters that should belong to them will be resolved by arbitration. That was the case in the case of NMC. The court in ADGN accepted that certain matters will be resolved under arbitration in UK, which is quite a sophisticated feature. If you continue with examples, I mean, you have the Emirates Hospital. It was a local bankruptcy proceeding in Abu Dhabi courts, domestic courts, but there were some proceedings happening in offshore courts on ADGM, some enforcement proceedings happening. There was some respect and some communication between courts. And you can continue with some liquidations that have happened abroad. There have been ample cooperation between the IFC courts and Cayman courts, cooperation and protocols agreed between liquidators. Sometimes they were the same, you know. But so all these things are not irrelevant, you know. I mean, they are a testament that the evolution, putting aside issues of new money and cramming down and so forth, when it comes to the concept of cross-border and the ability to work out innovative solutions and preserve and conserve value, I mean, I feel that we are, as pretty much as good as you could get, short of the US, you know, or the UK or some other sophisticated jurisdiction. But I would challenge and say that this has become an infant sophisticated jurisdiction when it comes to insolvency. I mean, Saudi has done a remarkable evolution as well in when it comes to insolvency. Most cases have been more domestic in nature. They have had less cross-border issues. I mean, but you have seen other salient factors, like the case of Asmil, with a perpetual instrument being approved by multiple banks. So the fact that Saudi have faced less cross-border challenges in the landmark cases have happened is not a testament that they are behind perhaps the UAE, but rather the nature of the cases that were filed in that jurisdiction. Okay.
Great. I think actually NMC, it's quite an interesting case study because it actually covers quite a lot of the things that people have been saying, because as Stefan mentioned, there was the two different administrations, one in England and one in the ADGM. There was also quite a lot of recognition issues because you had to deal with recognition onshore between the ADGM and onshore courts. So to Vikas's point, Saudi and the UAE, they've got multiple different jurisdictions within the same country. So it's quite easy to sort of think, oh, it's the UAE. But actually, this was an onshore group accessing ADGM proceedings with a footprint that's not only across the UAE, but also across the globe. And so that was a sort of example of lots of different elements of cross-border restructurings coming together to develop a solution for stakeholders.
Yeah, I was just going to add that in terms of one of the other trends that obviously we've seen is that the interest of the special situation funds, right? So if you look at the 5 or 6 years, I mean, I've been in this market now 17 years, and going back to our capita, but even things like Decree 57 and Dubai World case, those were ancient times in many ways. But if you think about There are many more funds that are now housed in ADGM, who are operating in this market, who have access to similar information that most of the legacy lenders have access to. But I think what's happening is two things are coming out. So one is clearly looking at optionality, right? So looking at where might be their interest best served, which is understandable, but also certainty, right? So I think these are two factors which are leading to forum shopping, the arbitrage between different jurisdictions, but of course it's also an issue around costs, because it's not the easiest to implement these solutions sometimes, efficiency and just time it takes, right? So there are multiple considerations, I suppose, but that's, I think, just maybe add as a further trend that's happened in the last 5-6 years.
I think what the UAE and Saudi now do, which is super helpful, is within a class of creditors you can cram down. So you don't need 100% to get something done. You need 2/3 typically. Yeah. I think if you look forward a little bit, what you can do in the UK now is you can cram up and cram down. So you have the Part 26A, which means you need one class of creditor, you need the requisite threshold, and then based on certain tests, you can cram the equity and you can cram whoever's above you as well. That infrastructure is not here yet, but maybe it will be in the future. But I think that's the key thing for me in the UAE and Saudi is you can cram down a class of creditors. So you get rid of the extreme holdout voice, and inject a bit of pragmatism into a process.
And to be honest, I mean, the sophistication of jurisdiction is determined by the ability to evolve, no? Like Darwin. So I mean, you can dictate on any institution, on any jurisdiction, a legal framework for whatever, for insolvencies in this case, and establish some infrastructure to deal with it. But if the environment is static and doesn't learn, then the trends are no trends, because you get stuck in whatever you get stuck. Here, what you can see is in whatever topic, and this is what is exciting, in whatever topic, yes, there were challenges between cross-emirate enforcement or offshore-onshore enforcement and recognition, but initiatives are being taken and have been taken to harmonize. So the leadership understood there are issues when it comes to harmonizing and educating domestic courts versus offshore courts. So on any topic, you always see that an issue arises simply because it's an issue that exists in that particular situation, but then even the courts or the system makes an effort to evolve and grow. And that's what you feel. So I feel that when it comes to investors, or when it comes to professionals, or when it comes to companies that are thinking, shall we file? I'm not so afraid to say, if we face an issue, we'll figure out a way to solve it and tackle it. Perhaps 10 years ago, that was not necessarily the case, that you were more afraid. But for example, you as DK, if you are facing a new novel issue, you feel more comfortable, no, when you go to your investment committee, that you will find a way.
Yeah, we've been in the region for 10, 11 years in size, and I think that kind of journey has been a journey of increasing conviction. Just because the insolvency regimes got better, you got precedents that make you feel more comfortable. You've obviously got the NPLs that are coming out now in the region. So I think it's been a very positive, iterative process. Yeah.
And I think the trajectory is going the way we want it to go as well. I mean, the legislative regimes are evolving. We are seeing cross-class cram-down options brought in some jurisdictions. And actually, I think the courts have shown a willingness to try and get to grips with a world that they, it's a new thing, right? It's a new thing for the region. It doesn't have the long history that you have in Europe, but people are demonstrating a will to get on top of it. And so I think it will have a real galvanizing effect as more people come into the market and the regional market participants sort of increase their sophistication. It feels like it's only going in one direction.
Cool. Okay. Right, we've got a couple of minutes. So maybe just as a sort of closing one, could everyone actually pick out the trend that they see sort of coming into this market into the new year. Vikas, do you want to go first?
No, thank you. I think. Listen, from my perspective, this is a journey we're on, right? And I think we're probably never going to arrive in a way. But as markets are maturing in this part of the world, as different jurisdictions are maturing at different paces, this arbitrage or this element will remain. I think the one trend is going to be that I would hope to believe that as more participants are coming, there'll be a lot more information sharing, a lot more sophistication, and people will be able to have better decision guidelines in terms of trying to get to these options.
Great,
Yeah, it's market participants for me. It's private credit coming into the market and shaking things up a bit. I think we'll see more and more of that, and that will have a big impact on the way we do restructurings going forwards.
For me, it's debt for equity swaps. So we've seen 2 this year, JBF and EHG, and I think those both set a very good precedent.
Great. Esteban?
I mean, I don't know. I mean, who knows what the next phase? But the trends will be dictated by the situation we may face down the road. I mean, but yeah, I mean, as I say before, I mean, I feel quite confident that no matter the situation, there's always a solution.
Great. Cool. Anything else? That's it? Okay. Thank you, everyone, and also thank you for listening.